I didn't even see him sit down. One moment I was tracing the rim of my wine glass, the air thick with the scent of garlic and rain, and the next, a shadow stretched across my table like the whisper of a storm. I looked up, expecting some late-night wanderer, a drunk maybe, someone with the clumsy charm of small talk and the shaky hands of loneliness. But instead, there he was, still silent and devastatingly composed, as if he owned not just the table, but the world around it. His suit was black, not the kind you rent for weddings, but the kind that made you wonder what kind of blood paid for it. The fabric clung to his broad shoulders like sin itself, and his eyes. God. His eyes didn't just look at me. They searched, they stripped, they decided. There was no curiosity in them, only certainty. The restaurant was nearly empty, just a few couples whispering over pasta, a lonely jazz tune twisting from an old speaker, and me, sitting alone in the corner booth that the host had offered with that pitiful half-smile people give to women who get stood up. I told him I liked the quiet. That was a lie. The truth was I couldn't stand the quiet. It made me think. It made me feel. And tonight, of all nights, I wanted to feel nothing. The man leaned in, his voice a low rumble, smooth as expensive whiskey. "You're my wife tonight." At first, I thought I'd misheard. Maybe it was the storm outside. Maybe the music had drowned the words. But no. He said it again, softer this time, almost tender, as if the sentence itself was a secret meant only for my bones to hear. "You're my wife tonight." I laughed, because what else could I do? It came out nervous, shaky, the kind of laugh that trembles on the edge of fear. "Excuse me?" I whispered, and my voice didn't even sound like mine. He didn't smile, didn't blink. "I need you to play along," he said, his gaze flicking toward the door, then back to me. "Don't look, just nod." Every instinct screamed to run, but there was something magnetic about the way he spoke. A quiet authority that made refusal seem impossible. The air around him was charged, alive, like standing too close to lightning. So I nodded, almost against my will, and the smallest ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "Good," he murmured. "Now hold my hand." My fingers slid into his, warm and firm, and the room changed. The waiter who'd been ignoring me suddenly straightened, offering a nervous nod in our direction. Someone behind the bar whispered something in Italian, and I caught the word, signora. Wife. I froze, my breath catching, because the word didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like a command that everyone else already understood. "Who are you?" I asked under my breath, my voice shaking. He looked at me for a long time, then tilted his head slightly, his thumb brushing my knuckles in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. "Someone who just saved your life," he said, his tone too casual for the weight of the words. My pulse stuttered. What does that even mean? He leaned closer, so close that I could smell his cologne, something dark and subtle like cedar smoke and sin. "It means," he whispered, "that if anyone asks, you're Mrs. Moretti. Understand?" The name hit me like a spark. I'd heard it before. You couldn't live in this city and not know it. Luca Moretti, the ghost that haunted police files, the name spoken in bars when the music dipped too low. Mafia, power, blood. My stomach dropped, but his eyes held me still, deep, gray, unreadable. "Why me?" I breathed. He shrugged slightly. "Because you were sitting alone." The simplicity of it chilled me more than anything else could have. Because I was alone. Because I was forgettable. Because I was convenient. The waiter returned with 2 plates I hadn't ordered. Fresh pasta, red wine, the kind of meal that screamed intimacy. "For Mr. and Mrs. Moretti," he said, smiling too widely, his voice trembling just a little. I wanted to say it wasn't true, to laugh, to end the illusion before it swallowed me whole. But then I caught the glint of metal. One of the men at the bar had a gun tucked under his jacket, and when he saw me looking, he smiled. That's when I realized this wasn't a game. Luca reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "Eat," he said softly. "And don't look scared. They're watching." I tried. I tried to lift the fork, to act normal, to pretend I wasn't sitting across from a man whose name made criminals pray. But the food tasted like ash, and every breath felt borrowed. The door opened behind me. Heavy footsteps. Laughter. My eyes flicked up, and I saw two men enter. Sharp suits, cruel faces, their attention snapping straight to Luca. The tension thickened instantly, invisible but suffocating. Luca didn't move, didn't even glance at them, but his grip on my hand tightened until I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. "Smile," he whispered, and the word felt like an order. So I smiled, pretending I belonged to him, pretending I wasn't shaking inside. The men paused, muttered something to each other, and then one of them laughed, low and mocking. "Didn't know you were the marrying kind, Moretti," one said. Luca looked up at him with a calm so cold it could freeze oceans. "Didn't know you were still breathing," he replied, his tone silky and cruel. Something passed between them, something sharp, dangerous, unsaid. Then the men backed off, retreating to another table. Luca exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking to me. "You did well," he murmured, almost gently. "What just happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They thought I was vulnerable," he said, reaching for his glass. "Now they think I'm unpredictable." I stared at him, every nerve ending screaming that I should get up and run. But when he looked at me again, something inside me stilled. He was terrifying, yes. But there was something else there, too. Something human. A flicker of exhaustion, maybe. Or regret. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper that brushed against my skin like silk. "Don't go home tonight." "Excuse me?" "They'll follow you," he said, "and if they think you're not mine, they'll kill you to get to me." My breath hitched. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was insane, but the way the bartender avoided eye contact, the way the waiter crossed himself as he passed our table, it all told me one thing. This man wasn't lying. "You can't just decide that I'm my wife tonight," he interrupted softly, eyes locked on mine. "That's how you stay alive." He stood, tossing cash onto the table, too much, like he was buying silence. Then he extended his hand toward me, palm open, patient, commanding. "Come with me," he said. I hesitated, my heart a thunder in my chest, the world tilting between fear and fascination. I wanted to say no. I wanted to walk out and pretend none of this ever happened, but something in his gaze held me. Not threat, not force, but a strange, dangerous certainty that felt like gravity. And so I stood, slipping my hand into his, feeling the weight of a choice I didn't understand. As he led me out into the storm, past the trembling waiter and the whispering shadows, I heard the sound of glass breaking somewhere behind us. A warning, or a promise. I didn't know then that by the time the sun rose, someone would be dead, and that I'd no longer be the woman who sat alone. The rain hit us the moment we stepped outside, cold and merciless, slicing through the night like tiny shards of glass that clung to my skin and refused to let go. And yet even the storm seemed to bend around him, as though it knew better than to stand in his way. His hand was still wrapped around mine, steady, warm, unyielding, guiding me toward a black car that waited at the curb, its engine purring low, headlights flickering like watchful eyes in the dark. I didn't ask where we were going, because some questions felt dangerous even before they were spoken, and there was something about the way he moved, deliberate, silent, confident, that told me the world had already decided what would happen next, and I was simply catching up to it. The door opened before we reached it. A man stepping out with the precision of someone trained to breathe only when told to. He nodded to Luca. Because of course I knew now that was his name. The one whispered in warnings and police briefings and neighborhood gossip that never dared speak too loudly. And then he looked at me, not with curiosity, but with confusion. Like he couldn't quite understand what I was doing there, what any woman was doing beside the devil himself. Luca said nothing. He only motioned for me to get in, and I did. Because what else was there to do? Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and smoke, that expensive kind of silence that only men with power could afford. He slid in beside me, his presence filling the car like heat, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The city blurred outside the window, wet streets, neon signs, the ghostly reflections of strangers who would never know that a girl was being swallowed whole by the night. Finally, I turned to him, voice low, trembling between anger and disbelief. You said I'd be safe. How can I be safe with you? He looked at me with those storm-gray eyes, unreadable, the kind of gaze that made you forget the question you asked. Because with me, he said, almost gently, you're untouchable. There was no arrogance in it, only certainty. And somehow that was worse because I could feel that he meant it. But beneath that confidence, something else lurked. Exhaustion, maybe, or guilt, or a grief so well hidden it had learned to wear his face. The car turned sharply, gliding down a narrow street where the lights flickered and died in patches, and I realized with a creeping dread that we weren't heading toward safety. We were heading deeper, into his world, into the shadows that knew his name. We stopped outside a building that didn't look like much from the outside. Old brick, faded sign, the kind of place that might have been a club once before the life drained out of it. But when the door opened, I saw the truth. Inside, it was alive, humming with low laughter and tension, the air thick with cigar smoke and power. Every head turned as we walked in, and I could feel it. The shift, the recognition, the disbelief. Mrs. Moretti. I heard it whispered, barely a breath, but it rippled through the room like wind over fire. Luca's hand pressed lightly against my back, steadying me as we moved past men who looked at him with reverence and fear, and at me with something closer to suspicion. It was surreal. Walking beside a man whose name could silence a room, pretending to be someone I wasn't, wearing a lie like a crown I hadn't asked for. At the far end, a table waited, and before I could sit, he pulled the chair out for me, that strange mix of chivalry and danger that made my pulse stutter. Eat, he said simply, nodding to a plate that someone had already set before me, and I wanted to ask how they'd known we were coming. But I knew better. In his world, nothing happened by chance. I picked at the food, my appetite drowned somewhere between fear and disbelief. But he ate with calm precision, every movement slow and controlled, as if the chaos around him had no permission to touch him. From the corner of my eye, I watched the room, the way the men spoke in murmurs, the way one of them kept glancing toward me with a sneer that made my stomach twist. Luca must have noticed, because his hand found mine again, squeezing once, hard enough to make the message clear. Don't react. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost its shape. Someone came over, tall, with a scar that cut across his jaw like a blade had tried to erase him. He leaned against the table, too close, his smile sharp. Didn't know you'd gone domestic, Luca, he said, his accent thick and mocking. She's beautiful, bit nervous though. New toy? Before I could even breathe, Luca's chair scraped against the floor, the sound cutting through the laughter and music like thunder. He stood, not fast, not loud, but with a stillness that froze every conversation around us. His hand came down on the man's shoulder, light at first, then crushing. The man's grin faltered. She's my wife, Luca said, voice calm, almost kind, but his eyes were pure steel. And I don't share what's mine. The words hit me like a physical touch, hot and cold all at once, and I hated the way they made something in me tremble. Not from fear, not exactly, but from the dangerous certainty in them, as if somewhere beneath the lies, he actually believed them. The man tried to laugh it off, but Luca's grip didn't ease, and for a moment, I thought he might actually break him right there. Then he released him, slow and deliberate, and the man stumbled back, eyes wide, pride shattered. The room stayed silent. No one dared to speak. And then, as if nothing had happened, Luca turned back to me, his voice soft again. "Finish your wine." I did, because I couldn't think of anything else to do, because the air was heavy with things I didn't understand. Danger, devotion, maybe both. When we finally left, the rain had softened to a drizzle, the kind that whispered instead of screamed. We walked toward the car in silence, and though I wanted to speak, to demand answers, to demand normal, the words died before they reached my lips. He opened the door for me again, that old-fashioned gesture that shouldn't have felt intimate, but somehow did. And when I sat inside, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked different. Not like myself. Not like the woman who had been stood up at a restaurant. I looked like someone who belonged to the night. As the car pulled away, I finally asked, "Was that all for show? What happened back there?" Luca leaned back, his jaw tight, eyes on the road ahead. "If they believe you're my wife," he said, his voice a low hum, "they'll stop trying to use you against me. You'll live longer." The words made no sense and yet made perfect, terrible sense. My heart hammered, my mind spinning between disbelief and the dawning truth that I was caught in something much bigger than coincidence. "Who are they?" I whispered. He turned his head, just enough for our eyes to meet in the dim light, and in that gaze I saw everything I didn't want to see. Violence, guilt, longing. "People who think they can hurt me," he said quietly. "They were wrong." The rain picked up again, tapping against the windows in a rhythm that felt too close to my heartbeat, and I realized I was trembling, though I couldn't tell if it was from fear or adrenaline. He reached out then, unexpectedly gentle, brushing a strand of wet hair from my face. "You did well tonight," he murmured. "You survived." The car slowed, turning into a street I didn't recognize. Tall iron gates, stone walls, the silhouette of a mansion in the distance. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He looked straight ahead, his hand still resting lightly against mine. "Home," he said. And as the gates opened with a heavy, echoing groan, I realized this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something I wasn't sure I'd survive. Because for the first time I understood what it meant when they said Luca Moretti never let anything, or anyone, go. The morning came not as light, but as a slow unraveling of shadows. A gray haze that pressed through the tall windows like it didn't belong, as if even the sun was hesitant to trespass into Luca Moretti's world. I woke beneath sheets that smelled faintly of cedar and danger, the kind of scent that clings to memory and refuses to fade. And for a moment, I didn't remember where I was, or why my heart was already pounding as though I'd been running in my sleep. Then it came back to me. The restaurant, the whispers, the bloodless calm of a man who could silence an entire room with a single look. And suddenly I was wide awake, sitting up too fast, the room spinning with disorientation and disbelief. It wasn't just a room. It was a prison disguised as paradise. The bed was enormous, the kind you only ever see in magazines. Silk sheets, carved posts, the faint shimmer of gold along the frame. And yet the beauty of it all only made it worse. Because every luxurious detail was a reminder that I didn't belong here. That this world had rules I didn't understand, and walls I couldn't escape. The drapes hung heavy, kind of fabric that drinks the light. And somewhere beyond them I could hear faint footsteps. Deliberate, echoing. Like the house itself was alive and listening. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and found the floor cold, marble polished to a mirror sheen that reflected a stranger in my place. Hair tangled, eyes wide, wearing the same black dress from last night, creased and wrinkled like the remnants of a dream that turned dark. My throat felt dry, my mind buzzing with questions I couldn't even form properly, and before I could gather the courage to stand, the door opened without a knock. It was a woman, tall and severe, her posture so straight it could have been carved from iron. She wore black, her hair pulled into a bun that didn't dare loosen, and when her eyes met mine, they softened for only a moment before she spoke. "Mr. Moretti asked that you have breakfast upstairs," she said, her accent crisp, her tone the kind that carried no room for debate. "I can't stay here," I murmured, though it came out weaker than I intended, more a plea than a statement. Her expression didn't change. "It's not safe for you to leave." "I don't even know him," I said, frustration cracking through the fog of fear. "I don't know what any of this is." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Pity, maybe, or resignation. "You will," she said simply, and then stepped aside, motioning toward the open door. The hallway was long and silent, lined with paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. All gilded frames and somber faces watching as I walked past, their painted eyes seeming to follow me with judgment or warning. I couldn't tell which. The air was cold, almost unnaturally so, and every step I took echoed faintly against the marble floor, as though the house was whispering its secrets through the sound. When we reached the dining room, he was already there, sitting at the head of a long table that looked more like it was built for war than breakfast. He was dressed in another black suit, crisp and effortless, one hand resting on a cup of coffee, the other scrolling through something on his phone, and for a heartbeat I wondered if he'd even slept. He looked up as I entered, and the moment our eyes met, the world seemed to tilt again, because there was nothing casual about the way he looked at me. Not possessive exactly, not even lustful but intense, like he was trying to memorize something only he could see. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice as calm and dangerous as the night before. I hesitated at the threshold, fingers twisting nervously. "You didn't give me a choice," I said, my words trembling but honest. He set his phone down, his attention fully on me now. "No," he said simply, "I didn't." The admission sent a shiver through me. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them, so unapologetic, so sure. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. Eat. You need your strength." I didn't move, not at first. To do what? Pretend to be your wife again? Something like amusement flickered across his face, gone almost as quickly as it came. "No," he said, "to stay alive." The woman who'd escorted me placed a tray on the table. Eggs, fruit, bread, things that looked almost absurdly ordinary in a place that felt anything but. I sat down slowly because standing felt like defiance, and I wasn't sure yet how far defiance could go before it became a mistake. Luca watched me, silent, unhurried, as I picked at the food, his gaze heavy but not cruel. "You have questions," he said finally. "Too many," I replied, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "Ask one." I swallowed hard. "Why me?" He leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said, and though his tone was calm, there was something in it. A flicker of regret, maybe, or guilt buried too deep to surface. And because once they saw you with me, you became part of this whether you wanted to or not. "Who are they?" "The people who want me dead," he said, his words smooth but laced with quiet venom. "And now, by association, the people who want you dead too." The room seemed to grow colder, the edges of my vision tightening as the reality of it sank in. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was insane, that I didn't belong in whatever nightmare he was living. But the truth was in his eyes, unshakable and grim. "I don't want to be part of your world," I said, my voice breaking. He studied me for a long moment, then said, "Neither did I." There was a pause then, long and strange, filled with things neither of us dared to say. He reached for his coffee again, taking a slow sip, his movements deliberate, measured, like he was always aware that someone could be watching. "You'll stay here until I decide it's safe," he said finally. "And if I refuse?" He smiled faintly, not cruel but knowing. "You won't." I hated that he was right. Hated the way my heart raced not just with fear, but with the strange, treacherous pull I felt every time he looked at me. He was everything I should have run from, and yet something in him made running feel impossible. The rest of breakfast passed in silence, the air thick with things unspoken. When I finally pushed my plate away, he stood, walking toward the window where the rain still traced lines against the glass. "They'll come again," he said quietly, almost to himself. "They always do. But they won't touch you. Not while you're mine." "I'm not yours," I whispered, though the words sounded fragile even to my own ears. He turned, his expression unreadable, his voice barely above a murmur. "Then you shouldn't look at me like you are." I didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to breathe around the chaos he carried so effortlessly. All I knew was that the man standing in front of me was both a threat and a promise, and I couldn't tell which one terrified me more. He walked past me toward the door, pausing only once to add, "You'll have guards outside your room. Don't test them." When he was gone, the silence felt heavier than his presence, pressing down on me until I couldn't sit still. I wandered back to the bedroom, every corridor a maze of shadows and whispered warnings, and when I finally shut the door behind me, I leaned against it, trying to steady the trembling in my hands. That's when I noticed it. The faintest stain on the edge of the silk sheets, dark and small but unmistakable. Blood. Not mine. For a moment I could only stare, my breath trapped in my throat, my mind conjuring every possibility. A wound, a threat. A memory of violence hidden beneath luxury. And then, as if the house itself wanted to answer, I heard it. The distant, muted sound of shouting from somewhere below, followed by a crash, then silence. The kind of silence that comes before something breaks. The sound didn't stop echoing in my head. That sharp, sudden crash. The echoing silence that followed, the kind that feels like the air itself is holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. And though I told myself it was nothing, that maybe someone had just dropped a tray, or a door had slammed too hard, I knew, deep down, that nothing in Luca Moretti's world ever happened by accident. I stood there for what felt like minutes, maybe longer, listening to the quiet stretch and twist through the corridors of the mansion until it became unbearable, until my curiosity finally outweighed my fear, and I found myself moving toward the door with slow, hesitant steps, the marble floor cold beneath my bare feet, the silk hem of my borrowed robe whispering against my skin. I told myself I wouldn't open the door, that I would just listen. But the thing about fear is that it never stays still. It moves, it grows, it pulls you toward the very thing you're afraid of. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the air felt different, heavier, the faint scent of smoke threading through it like a secret trying to escape. I followed it, down the long corridor and around the corner, my pulse drumming in my ears until I heard voices. Low, tense, urgent. Luca's voice was one of them. I couldn't make out all the words at first, only fragments carried through the open space, the occasional edge of steel in his tone that made my stomach twist. I moved closer, staying in the shadow of the staircase, my hands clutching the cold banister like it might anchor me to something real. "I told you not to bring it here," Luca's voice low and sharp, a warning more than anger. "He didn't make it," another voice answered, strained, unfamiliar. "They got to him first." There was silence after that, a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest until I could barely breathe. And then Luca said something I couldn't fully hear. But the tone, the slow, deliberate way he spoke, sent a chill crawling down my spine. And then, the sound I'd been dreading, the dull, heavy thud of something hitting the floor. I froze. There was no scream, no argument, no further sound at all, just Luca's voice again, quieter now, as if speaking to himself. "Clean it up." I backed away before they could see me, my heart racing so hard it hurt, my thoughts a frantic blur. By the time I reached my room again, I was shaking, every part of me trembling with the effort of holding in the panic that threatened to spill out. I shut the door, locked it, and pressed my back against it. But the walls felt too close, too heavy, like they knew what had happened below them. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he'd meant something else. But the stain on the sheets, the shouting, the silence that followed, it all painted a picture I didn't want to see. One where Luca Moretti wasn't just dangerous, but deadly. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The night stretched on endlessly, every creak of the house pulling me deeper into thoughts I didn't want to face. And by morning, when the light finally crept in, I felt like I'd been awake for years. Breakfast was delivered to my door this time. No invitation, no words, just a tray left outside like an offering to someone who might bite if approached too closely. I ignored it. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind wouldn't quiet. By mid-morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed answers, or at least the illusion of them. I found him in the library, if that's what you could call it. A cavernous room lined with shelves that stretched up into shadow. The smell of old paper and cigar smoke heavy in the air. He stood by the window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a phone, speaking in a voice so low it felt like a sin to interrupt. He didn't turn when I entered. "You shouldn't wander," he said, his tone calm but laced with that quiet authority that always made me feel like I was already breaking some invisible rule. "I heard something last night," I said, forcing the words past the dryness in my throat. "Downstairs, I heard you." He ended the call without looking back. "You shouldn't have." "That's not an answer," I said, my voice shaking. "What happened?" Finally, he turned. His expression was unreadable, eyes cold but not cruel, the kind of face that could hold both truth and lies without ever showing which was which. "You don't want to know," he said simply. "Yes, I do." He studied me for a long moment, his gaze heavy, assessing. Then slowly he walked toward me, every step deliberate, his presence swallowing the room until I had to fight the instinct to step back. "The man you heard," he said quietly, "was a traitor. He sold information to my enemies, and he paid for it." The words landed like stones. I wanted to be horrified, to recoil, but there was something about the calmness with which he said it, not boasting, not cruel, simply factual, that left me more unsettled than if he'd shouted. "You killed him," I whispered. He didn't deny it. "If I hadn't," he said, "you wouldn't be standing here." I shook my head, anger and confusion warring inside me. "You can't expect me to just accept that." "I don't expect anything from you," he said, voice low, almost gentle. "But you're alive because of me, whether you like that or not." There was no malice in it, only truth, and somehow that made it worse. I turned away, pacing toward the shelves, needing distance, needing space to breathe. You talk like this is normal. In my world, he said, it is. His world. The words hung there, cold and final, like a wall between us that I could never cross. When I faced him again, he was closer, the light from the window catching the faint scar near his temple, the kind of mark that told stories he'd never share. You're safe here, he said softly, but only as long as they believe the lie. What lie? That you're mine. I flinched. You said it was just for one night. It was supposed to be, he said, and for the first time something cracked in his voice. Not weakness exactly, but weariness. But they've seen you now. They've seen your face. If you leave, they'll follow you. They'll use you, and they won't stop until I'm dead. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that none of this was my problem, that I didn't belong in a world of bullets and blood and whispered threats. But then I saw it. The faint tremor in his hand, the shadow beneath his calm. And I realized he wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting me too. Why? I asked softly. Why risk anything for me? He met my eyes, and for a moment the silence between us felt like something alive. Because once you sat at my table, he said, you became a part of it, and I don't lose what's mine. The words should have terrified me, and they did. But there was something else beneath them, something that sounded almost like confession. I wanted to hate him, but as he stood there, close enough that I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes, I realized I didn't. I was afraid of him, yes, but I was also afraid of how much I wanted to understand him. He stepped back, the moment breaking like glass. You'll stay here until I decide it's safe. There's nowhere else for you to go. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because I already knew he was right. As he turned to leave, I said the only thing I could manage. What happens when they stop believing the lie? He paused at the door, glancing over his shoulder, his voice soft but certain. Then the only thing left will be the truth. And as the door closed behind him, I realized the most terrifying part wasn't what he'd said. It was that I wanted to know what his truth was. The days in Luca's mansion passed like smoke. Shapeless, silent, impossible to hold. And yet every hour felt too full, too sharp, as if the house itself was alive and breathing, watching me with eyes hidden behind its walls. It was too large for silence, too beautiful for peace. And yet it felt like a cathedral built for ghosts. Every sound echoing longer than it should. Every whisper carrying weight I didn't understand. I didn't know how many rooms there were. I'd stopped trying to count after the fifth hallway turned back on itself, leading me somewhere I didn't mean to go. The place was a labyrinth. Tall ceilings, portraits of strangers who might have been family or enemies or both. Their faces painted with the kind of sorrow that time can't erase. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass thick, enough to make the outside world seem distant and unreal. And I wondered if that was the point. To make escape feel like a dream rather than an option. The staff moved like shadows, speaking softly, always polite but never warm. They looked at me the way people look at a storm, uncertain if I would destroy or be destroyed. I could feel their judgment in the silence that followed me down every corridor, could see it in the way they lowered their eyes when I spoke, as though the title of Mrs. Moretti, even as a lie, gave me a kind of power they neither trusted nor believed. It was the woman from before, the one who had brought me breakfast that first morning, who finally broke the rhythm of that quiet, bringing me a folded stack of clothes one afternoon as I sat by the window, staring at the rain that seemed to fall forever. She introduced herself as Isabella, though her voice carried a faint hesitation, as if even her own name might be overheard. I brought you something to wear, she said, setting the clothes down on the chair beside me. Soft fabrics, simple but expensive, the kind of luxury that pretends to be humble. Mr. Moretti doesn't like when guests wear the same thing twice. I'm not his guest, I said, though even as I spoke I knew how hollow it sounded. She gave me a look I couldn't quite read. Pity, perhaps, or understanding too deep to name. No, she said quietly. You're not. And then she left, as silently as she came. I stared at the clothes for a long time before touching them, before letting the fabric slide between my fingers, smooth and weightless, and I thought about how strange it was, to be imprisoned in comfort, to be wrapped in silk and fear at the same time. That evening, I heard the sound of a piano. It came from somewhere below, soft and hesitant at first, then fuller, richer, as if the notes were remembering what it felt like to be alive. I followed the sound, barefoot, careful not to draw attention, my fingers brushing along the wall as I moved through the dimly lit hallways. The music pulled me, something gentle beneath all the steel, something that didn't fit the man I thought I knew. When I reached the grand hall, I saw him there. Luca, alone at the piano, his fingers moving with surprising grace, each note lingering in the air like a thought he couldn't speak aloud. He didn't see me at first, and for a few moments I just stood there, hidden behind the doorway, watching him. It was strange, seeing him like that, stripped of the sharp edges and control, his face softened by something almost human, almost tender. Then his hands stilled, and without turning, he said, "You shouldn't sneak up on people in this house." I froze, my heart skipping. I heard the music, I said, stepping into the light. He looked up then, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Not anger, not quite surprise, but something that looked like memory. "Do you play?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. My mother tried to teach me when I was a kid. I never had the patience." He smiled faintly, that rare, fleeting expression that made his whole face seem younger, less haunted. "It's not about patience," he said. "It's about control." He gestured toward the seat beside him, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I moved toward it. The space between us charged and quiet. The piano gleamed under the dim chandelier light, black and flawless like something sacred. "Try," he said softly. I hesitated, then pressed a single key. Tentative, clumsy, out of place. The note rang sharp against the stillness, and I pulled my hand back, embarrassed. He reached out then, his fingers brushing over mine. A brief, unthinking touch, warm and steady. "Again," he murmured. This time the note sounded different. Not perfect, but softer. He leaned closer, his voice a low whisper near my ear. "You see? Control." I could feel the warmth of him beside me, the faint scent of his cologne, dark, subtle, something I could never quite name. And for a moment, everything else fell away. The fear, the uncertainty, the walls of the mansion, all of it blurred into something else. Something I didn't want to admit felt dangerously close to longing. He played again then, the melody slow and haunting, and I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. It felt like a confession without words, a story of violence and guilt and tenderness braided together. When he stopped, the silence was too loud. "Who were they?" I asked quietly. "The people in the paintings?" He looked at them, the portraits lining the hall, their painted eyes heavy with history. "Family," he said. "Some loyal, some not." "Are they all gone?" He didn't answer right away. "In this life," he said finally. "Everyone is gone eventually." The words lingered, heavy and final, and I wondered if he was talking about them, or about himself. He stood then, his movements slow, deliberate. "Come," he said, gesturing toward the stairs. "There's something I want you to see." We walked through corridors I hadn't explored, past doors that stayed locked, and rooms that smelled faintly of dust and secrets. Finally, we stopped before a smaller door. Wooden, unremarkable. He opened it, revealing a room unlike any other I'd seen. It was filled with maps, files, photographs, names scribbled in neat, precise handwriting. The air smelled of ink and gun oil. "This is what my life costs," he said. "Every name in here is a debt, a promise, a threat." I stared at the papers, at the faces, men, women, strangers who had become targets or allies or ghosts. "And me?" I asked, barely a whisper. "What am I?" He turned to me then, his eyes shadowed, his voice quiet but certain. "You're the lie that saves me," he said, "the only one that still might." I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. Only that there was something in the way he said it. Something that made my chest tighten. When we left the room, he locked the door behind us. The click of the lock sounded final, like a line drawn in the dark. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of rain whispering against the glass, and I thought about what he'd said, about debts, about lies, about the way he looked at me when he said I saved him. And then sometime past midnight I heard it again. Not music this time, but footsteps outside my door. Slow. Careful. Stopping right outside. The handle turned, just once, testing. Then silence. I didn't breathe, because in that moment I knew. Whoever was outside wasn't him. The silence that followed was the kind that didn't just fill a room. It pressed against the walls, against the air, against my lungs, until even breathing felt like something dangerous, something that might give me away. I stayed very still, my heart a trembling pulse in my throat, my fingers gripping the sheets as though the silk could somehow protect me, my eyes locked on the door where that faint movement had come from. Whoever it was stood on the other side, close enough that I could almost feel their breath through the wood, and though the handle didn't turn again, I could hear it, the soft scrape of leather, the whisper of weight shifting on the floorboards, the unmistakable presence of someone who shouldn't be there. I thought about calling out, but the sound caught in my throat, because if it wasn't Luca, and I knew it wasn't, then calling for him might only bring the threat closer, might tell whoever waited in the hallway that I was awake, that I was listening, that I was afraid. So I stayed silent, counting my breaths, praying the footsteps would fade. But they didn't. They lingered, patient, deliberate, until finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I heard them retreat, slow and cautious, disappearing down the hall until the house swallowed them whole. Only then did I move. I slid out of bed, my bare feet soundless on the cold marble floor, the thin robe I wore clinging to my skin as though it could sense my fear. I didn't think. I just went. Through the door, down the corridor, following the faintest echo of movement, the faintest thread of instinct that told me I couldn't stay still. Not when something was prowling inside these walls. The mansion at night was a different creature altogether. Darker, heavier, alive in ways it wasn't during the day. The chandeliers were dimmed to a dull amber glow, the portraits seemed to lean closer, and every sound, the tick of a clock, the distant hum of rain, carried an edge that made my heart jump. I turned the corner and froze. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, half hidden by shadow. Not Luca. The body was smaller, thinner, the posture wrong, tense, alert, waiting. When the intruder saw me, they moved fast, too fast. A flash of motion and then the glint of something metallic under the low light. I didn't scream. I ran. Bare feet against marble, breath burning in my lungs, the sound of pursuit pounding behind me like a second heartbeat. I didn't know where I was going, only that the house had become a maze again, and I had no map, no escape, just fear propelling me forward. I turned down a side corridor, slammed a door behind me, locked it, pressed my back against it. Silence. Then, a voice. "Open it, Elena." Luca. His voice was low, controlled, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable, the same cold sharpness I'd heard in the restaurant when he'd faced his enemies. I fumbled for the lock and pulled the door open, and before I could speak, before I could even explain, he was there, one arm wrapping around me, pulling me close against him in a way that felt like both protection and possession. "What happened?" he asked, his voice quiet but dangerous, his breath brushing the top of my head. "Someone," I tried to say, but my words tripped over each other. "Someone was outside my door. I heard them. I swear." His hand came up, stilling me. "I know." He released me and stepped past, gun already drawn. I hadn't even seen him reach for it, his movements so precise they barely seemed human. He opened the door wider, scanning the hall, his eyes shifting like a predator's. "Stay behind me," he said, and I did, because the command in his voice left no room for disobedience. We moved together through the corridors, past the dim lights and heavy drapes, until we reached the west end of the house, a part I hadn't seen before. He stopped, crouched low, and for the first time I noticed the faintest trail on the floor. Muddy footprints, half wiped, leading toward a side door. He followed them without hesitation, his body tense but steady, and when we reached the door, he threw it open and vanished into the night. I waited, frozen in the doorway, the cold air rushing in, smelling of rain and gunpowder. There were shouts, distant but unmistakable, and then a single gunshot that cracked through the silence, echoing across the courtyard like thunder splitting the sky. I didn't realize I was shaking until he returned, his silhouette framed by the doorway, the rain beating against his coat, his expression unreadable. There was blood on his hand. "It's handled," he said quietly, as though that was enough explanation. But it wasn't. My voice trembled. "You killed him." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The blood looked dark against his skin, darker even than the night behind him, and for a moment I couldn't look away. It wasn't the violence that terrified me. Not really. It was the calm. The terrifying ease with which he accepted it. The quiet that followed, as if this was nothing more than a routine interruption. He must have seen the fear in my eyes because something in his expression softened. Just barely. And then he stepped closer. Slow and deliberate. His hand still stained red. "He wasn't here for you," he said, "but he would have used you to get to me." I took a step back, my breath shallow. "So I'm bait now?" He shook his head. "You're a reason." I didn't know what that meant. Not really, but I felt it. The weight of it, the truth of it. He moved closer again, and this time I didn't retreat. His hand lifted, brushing a strand of wet hair from my cheek, the gesture unexpectedly tender for someone who had just ended a life minutes before. The touch was light, careful, almost reverent, and my heart betrayed me. It steadied instead of racing, as if my body couldn't decide whether to run or lean into him. "You shouldn't have been alone," he said softly. "I didn't know what else to do." He nodded, his gaze flicking briefly to my mouth before returning to my eyes. "You listen when I tell you to stay close next time. Understand?" There was something in his tone that made the word understand sound like a promise and a threat all at once. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I did. He turned then, as if to leave, but I caught his wrist, the one still streaked with blood, without thinking, without understanding why. His pulse was steady under my fingers, his skin warm despite the cold. "Does it ever stop?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The killing?" He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes dark and tired. "No," he said finally. But sometimes it's not about stopping. Sometimes it's about surviving long enough to regret it. Something in my chest cracked open then. Pity, maybe, or something deeper and far more dangerous. And before I could stop myself, I reached up, my fingers brushing against his jaw, the faint scrape of stubble against my skin grounding me in a way words couldn't. He didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, the world went still. The rain outside, the blood between us, the ghosts that haunted his name. All of it fell away, leaving only this fragile, reckless moment where our wounds seemed to recognize each other. When he finally leaned in, it wasn't the kind of kiss that ignites. It was the kind that consumes. Slow, heavy, inevitable. His hand slid to the back of my neck, his mouth firm but careful, his breath mingling with mine like a confession neither of us wanted to make. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cruel either. It was desperate. The kind of kiss that comes from knowing how easily the world can take everything away. When it broke, I didn't move. He pressed his forehead against mine, his voice a low whisper. "You don't know what you're doing." "Maybe not," I breathed. "But neither do you." He let out a quiet laugh, not amused, not really, more like disbelief at himself, and stepped back. His control, returning like armor slipping back into place. "Go to bed," he said softly. "Lock the door. You're safe now." But as I watched him walk away, his figure fading into the dim corridor, I realized something I couldn't ignore. The danger wasn't only outside these walls anymore. It was him. It was me. It was the fire that had started between us, the one that neither of us knew how to put out. Morning came heavy, dragging behind it the taste of thunder and smoke, and when I opened my eyes, it felt as if the entire mansion was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something inevitable. Something already set in motion long before I arrived here. The air carried a strange stillness. Not peace, but the kind of silence that lingers before a storm, when the world itself seems to pause and listen. I could feel it in my chest, that quiet hum of unease, as if the night had left behind its ghosts, and they were still wandering the halls, whispering secrets into the walls that only Luca could understand. I didn't see him at breakfast. The table that usually seemed too long for two people felt longer still without him. And though the food was laid out as carefully as always, fruit glistening like jewels, bread still warm, it all felt lifeless, as though even the house refused to pretend at normalcy. Isabella served me in silence, her movements brisk and efficient, her face a mask of composure that only cracked for a fraction of a second when I asked where he was. "Handling something," she said finally, setting down the coffee cup a little too firmly. "Something?" I asked, though I knew the word meant everything and nothing in Luca's world. She hesitated, then met my eyes. "There's been movement." I didn't know what that meant, but the tremor in her voice told me it wasn't good. After she left, I sat for a while, staring at the untouched food, my reflection trembling in the dark surface of my coffee. And I thought about the man who had walked away from me last night. The man who carried blood on his hands and tenderness in his touch. The contradiction that was Luca Moretti. I wondered if he ever slept. If he ever stopped thinking about the next threat. The next betrayal. The next person who would try to kill him. I wondered if I had become one more name on that list. A weakness disguised as a lie, a liability that could destroy him if he cared too much. The thought should have comforted me, but instead it hollowed something out inside me. I don't know what possessed me to wander after that. Maybe boredom, maybe curiosity, or maybe just the unbearable weight of being trapped in someone else's war. But my feet carried me through the corridors, past the locked rooms and curtained windows, until I reached the far wing of the mansion, a place I hadn't been before, where the air smelled faintly of gun oil and dust, where the doors were reinforced with metal, and the walls seemed thicker, more deliberate. It wasn't part of the house meant to be seen. I heard voices there. Low, urgent, male. I pressed my ear to the door, just for a moment, long enough to hear Luca's voice, sharper than I'd ever heard it before. "They hit the docks again," he was saying, "and they're not backing off this time." Another man answered, rough, impatient. "We warned them. They don't care. They want blood." Luca's reply came after a pause, cold and deliberate. "Then we'll give it to them." Something inside me twisted. The quiet man who had played piano by candlelight, the man who had kissed me like it meant something he couldn't admit. He was gone, replaced by the man they all whispered about, the man who ruled a city from the shadows. I stepped back before I could hear more, but as I turned, the door opened behind me and his voice, calm, unshaken, found me like a thread pulling taut. "Eavesdropping?" I froze, caught mid-step, my pulse quickening as I turned to face him. He stood in the doorway, expression unreadable, his suit immaculate, his hands clean this time, though I didn't believe for a second that they had stayed that way for long. "I heard voices," I said softly. "I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, silencing me. "You should be more careful. Curiosity gets people killed in this house." The words weren't cruel, but they carried a weight that made my stomach turn. I looked at him, at the calm precision in his movements, at the way his jaw tightened like he was already miles ahead, planning, anticipating. "Are you at war?" I asked before I could stop myself. He didn't answer right away, just looked past me, toward the window where the first drops of rain were beginning to fall again. "War isn't a moment," he said finally. "It's a condition." Something in his tone made me shiver. I wanted to ask what that made me, but before I could, the sound came, sudden, sharp, breaking the air like the crack of the world splitting open. Gunfire. The echo of it was unmistakable. Not distant this time, but close, too close, somewhere inside the grounds. Luca moved instantly, faster than I thought a person could move, drawing his gun with a smoothness that was almost beautiful in its precision. "Stay behind me," he ordered, but there was no time to argue because the next moment, the windows shattered. Glass exploded inward, shards catching the light like diamonds as they rained across the marble. And Luca grabbed me, pulling me down, his body covering mine as chaos tore through the quiet. The air filled with the sound of bullets and shouting, men yelling in Italian, the dull thud of boots against stone. The mansion that had felt like a cage became a battlefield in seconds. "Stay low," he said, his breath hot against my ear, his voice steady even now. I nodded, too terrified to speak. My body pressed against the floor, the scent of gunpowder thick and metallic, around us. Then he was gone, moving, commanding, his voice sharp and unyielding as he barked orders. I could hear him through the ringing in my ears, every word a thread of control in the chaos. I crawled toward the nearest wall, hiding behind an overturned chair, heart hammering so violently it hurt. The gunfire slowed, became sporadic. And then, silence again. A door slammed somewhere, heavy footsteps followed, and then Luca reappeared, blood splattered across his collar, one sleeve torn. He was breathing hard but steady, his eyes dark and furious. "It's over," he said, though the tension in his body said otherwise. I stood shakily, my knees weak, my voice a whisper. "What happened?" He looked at me, the corner of his mouth twitching in something like grim amusement. "You happened," he said quietly. "They came for you." The words hit like a physical blow. For me, but... "They know who you are now," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and dangerous. "They think you're leverage." "I'm not—" "Yes, you are," he interrupted, his tone suddenly raw. "You're leverage because I made you mine, because I couldn't let them see you as anything else." He was close enough now that I could see the cut on his cheek, the streak of blood drying along his jaw. Without thinking, I reached for him, my hand trembling as I touched his face. He flinched, just slightly, as if the gentleness of it startled him. "Let me help you," I said softly. He shook his head, but didn't pull away. "You can't." "I can try." And then he did something unexpected. He laughed, a low, broken sound that wasn't amusement at all, more like disbelief. "You shouldn't care," he said. "Not about me." "Maybe I don't," I lied. He smiled faintly, that same tired, devastating smile that made my chest ache. "Then stop looking at me like you do." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I led him to a chair, made him sit, found a towel from the table, pressed it gently against the wound on his arm. He watched me the whole time, not saying a word, not stopping me either. And when our eyes met, the air between us changed again, thick with something unspoken and dangerous. When I pulled back, his hand caught mine, holding it still. "You don't belong in this," he said quietly. "I didn't choose it," I whispered. "No," he said, his grip tightening. "But you're in it now." Outside, the rain began to fall harder, the storm breaking open over the city. Inside, the silence between us felt heavier than the gunfire had, filled with things neither of us wanted to admit. Because we both knew something had shifted. Not just outside, but between us. And whatever it was, it couldn't be undone. He stood slowly, his voice low. "This isn't over. They'll come again." "And what happens when they do?" I asked. His eyes met mine, dark and certain. "Then I'll burn the world before I let them take you." And even though I should have been terrified, I wasn't. Because the war wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside me too. The storm didn't stop. It went on through the night and into the morning. A relentless rhythm against the glass that sounded almost like breathing. Like the house itself was exhaling in exhaustion after surviving another night of violence. I barely slept. Every sound, every creak, every whisper of wind made me flinch. Because after the gunfire, after the shouting and blood, silence didn't mean safety anymore. It meant waiting. And waiting was worse than fear. When I finally pulled myself from bed, the sky was a dull gray bruise outside the windows, the kind that made time feel meaningless, and the mansion felt different. Smaller somehow, its corridors filled with the smell of smoke and rain and the faint metallic tang of blood that no amount of polish could hide. I dressed without thinking, without really feeling the fabric against my skin, because it didn't matter what I wore. I wasn't a person here anymore. I was a symbol, a secret, a liability. Isabella didn't come that morning, which was unusual. She was always there, quiet and efficient, a constant reminder that this place ran on routine. But now the rhythm was broken. The silence felt wrong. So I left my room and wandered, drawn by something I couldn't name. Curiosity, maybe, or dread, or the need to prove to myself that I wasn't just a piece of furniture in Luca Moretti's gilded cage. I found him in his study. He stood near the desk, back turned to me, his posture as composed as ever. But there was something about the air around him, something taut and brittle, like the room itself was holding its breath. The light was dim, filtering through the curtains in pale strips that cut across his face when he finally turned, and for a moment, I saw the exhaustion he tried so hard to hide. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. "I could say the same," I replied, though my voice lacked the conviction I wanted it to have. "This is my prison too, isn't it?" He smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "It's safer for you here." "I'm not safe," I said, the words sharper than I expected. "Not from them, not from you, not from what's happening outside these walls." His eyes lifted to mine then, steady and calm, but something behind them flickered. Guilt, maybe, or fear, or both. What do you want from me, Elena? He asked quietly. The truth, I said, and even I was surprised at how steady my voice was. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked around the desk, poured himself a drink from the decanter that gleamed like liquid gold in the low light, and took a slow sip, his hand trembling only slightly as he set the glass down. The truth, he repeated, as if tasting the word. You think you want that, but you don't. I do, I said, because I can't live like this, being protected from things I don't understand, trapped in a world I never chose. You owe me the truth. He laughed then, quietly, a sound that carried no joy. You sound like you still believe anyone in this world owes you anything. That should have hurt, but it didn't. Not really. Because I'd already begun to suspect that kindness wasn't something he gave freely, that every gesture, every word, every touch was a transaction. Still, I pressed. Then tell me why they're after me. Tell me why they keep coming. Tell me what you did that made them want me dead too. He looked at me for a long time, long enough that the silence stretched into something unbearable. And then finally he said it. The truth that would tear everything apart. They think you're the reason their shipment was lost, he said quietly. They think I used you to destroy their operation. My mind reeled. What? You were seen with me, he continued, his voice too calm, too even. They believed I sent you to distract one of their men, to get information. When the deal collapsed, they assumed you were the leak. That's insane, I whispered, though even as I said it, I knew how little that word meant in this world. I tried to tell them otherwise, he said, and the way he said tried made my stomach twist. But in this business, perception is stronger than truth. They saw you as my weakness, and when people find a weakness, they use it. Something cold spread through me then, slow and suffocating. So all of this, pretending to be your wife, staying here being hunted, it's because of something you did? He didn't answer, and that silence told me everything. I took a step back, shaking my head. You said you were protecting me. I am. No, I said, my voice breaking. You're protecting yourself. You're using me to make them think you still control the situation, to make them believe I matter enough to keep me alive. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened, his hands curling slightly at his sides. It's not that simple. It never is with you, I said bitterly. You always make it sound like everything you do is out of necessity, like you don't have a choice, like the blood on your hands is just another accident. He moved toward me then, his steps measured, deliberate. You think I wanted this? He asked, his voice low but sharp. You think I wanted you involved, wanted you hunted, wanted you to see what I am? I think you knew exactly what would happen, I said, my heart pounding, and you did it anyway. For a moment I thought he would yell, that he would finally lose that icy control he wore like armor. But instead he just stood there, breathing hard, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost broken. You were supposed to be one night, he said. Just one night. And then I saw you and I couldn't let it go. That was my mistake. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to hate him for it, but I couldn't, because part of me had known it all along, that the danger between us wasn't one-sided, that whatever bound us together had been growing like fire under the floorboards, waiting for the right moment to burn through. I turned away, my hands shaking. I have to leave. You can't, he said immediately, his tone firm, almost desperate. They'll kill you the moment you step outside those gates. Then at least I'll die free, I whispered. He was beside me before I could move, his hand catching my wrist, the pressure of his grip strong enough to make me stop, but not enough to hurt. Don't say that, he said, his voice trembling just slightly. Don't talk like that. Then let me go, I said, meeting his eyes. If you really care, if there's even a part of you that means what you say, then let me leave. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Conflict, pain, something too raw to name. And then he let go. Just like that. But the look he gave me as I stepped back made my heart stop. It wasn't defeat. It was resignation. Go if you want, he said quietly. But understand this, if you leave now, you won't make it a mile. They're waiting, and if they take you, I won't be able to save you. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just turned and walked away, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out the sound of the rain, the echo of my footsteps mixing with the thunder outside. I didn't look back until I reached the door. He was still standing there, motionless, his eyes following me like a promise I didn't want to understand. And as I stepped into the storm, I realized something terrible. The betrayal wasn't that he'd lied to me. It was that I still wanted him to come after me. The night swallowed me whole the moment I stepped beyond the gates, the storm slashing through the air like it had been waiting for me, the rain striking my face so hard it felt almost personal, as if the sky itself wanted to punish me for daring to leave him. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan, didn't even have shoes made for running, but I ran anyway, through puddles and gravel and mud, through the weight of everything I was leaving behind, because staying had become unbearable, because every look, every word, every touch in that house had started to feel like a confession and a cage at the same time. The wind tore at my hair, my dress clung to my skin, and my lungs burned with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from distance but from fear, from the kind of terror that claws at you from the inside and refuses to let go. I didn't know if I was crying or if it was just the rain, but my vision blurred until the road became a ribbon of black beneath me, stretching endlessly toward nowhere. For a moment I thought I'd made it, that I could keep running until I disappeared, until Luca Moretti was nothing but a shadow and a memory. But then I saw them. Headlights, 2 sets, cutting through the darkness ahead, the light bouncing off the wet asphalt like liquid fire. My heart stuttered, my feet skidding on the slick ground, and before I could turn back, before I could even scream, the world exploded in sound, screeching tires, slamming doors, footsteps pounding against the wet earth. Rough hands grabbed me from behind, fingers digging into my arms, cold and hard and merciless. I fought. God, I fought. Kicking, clawing, screaming his name even though I hated myself for it, even though I didn't know if I wanted him to hear me or if I just needed someone to. But they were too strong. Too many. And within seconds, the rain and the mud and the night swallowed my voice whole. Got her, one of them said, his accent thick, his grip bruising as he dragged me toward the van parked just beyond the trees. I tried to twist free, my feet slipping, my nails scraping across wet metal as they shoved me inside. The door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness broken only by the faint red glow of a taillight seeping through a crack. I could smell sweat and gasoline and something else. Fear. Thick and sour. One of them laughed. The boss'll want to see her alive, he said. Alive for how long? Another voice answered, and they both laughed. I pressed myself against the wall of the van, trying to steady my breathing, trying not to think about what they meant. Every bump of the road jarred through my body, every sound outside felt amplified, and somewhere beneath the panic, a different thought crept in. Not of escape, but of him. Of Luca. Would he come? Would he even know? And if he did, what would he do? The drive felt endless. My wrists throbbed where they'd tied them, the rope digging into my skin, and by the time the van finally stopped, I'd lost all sense of time, of distance, of myself. The doors opened to the glare of floodlights, and the rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and heavy, the ground slick beneath my bare feet as they dragged me out. The place looked like a warehouse, old and half abandoned, The kind of place where things and people disappeared. I could hear the faint hum of machinery, the dripping of water through holes in the ceiling, and somewhere above it all, the low murmur of men's voices. They pushed me forward until I stumbled, my knees hitting concrete, and then I heard it. A slow clap, deliberate, mocking. "Well?" A voice drawled, deep and unfamiliar, smooth in the way only real danger ever is. So the infamous Mrs. Moretti finally steps into the real world. I looked up. The man who stood before me was nothing like Luca. Where Luca was controlled and cold, this man was chaos dressed in charm. He was younger, maybe, or maybe just hungrier. His smile sharp and joyless. His eyes flicked over me like I was inventory. "I've been curious," he said, stepping closer, his shoes echoing against the floor. "What kind of woman makes the devil himself hesitate?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. He crouched beside me, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of smoke on his clothes. "You're not much to look at right now," he said softly. But then again, maybe that's what he likes. Broken things. He reached out, tilting my chin upward, and I jerked away, earning a laugh from the men behind him. "Feisty," he murmured. "I can see why he's so protective." "What do you want?" I managed to say, my voice hoarse. He smiled again. Slow, deliberate. "What I've always wanted," he said. "Everything Luca Moretti thinks he owns." He stood, motioning to the men. "Make sure she's comfortable. We'll send him the invitation soon enough." They dragged me away again, into a smaller room that smelled of damp concrete and old rust. They tied me to a chair, the ropes biting deeper this time, and then they left, the sound of the lock clicking behind them echoing like a verdict. For a long time I just sat there, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, trying not to think about what was coming. The darkness pressed close, thick and suffocating, and I found myself whispering his name, not out of hope, but out of habit. Because even when I hated him, even when I wanted to escape, his name had become a prayer and a curse all at once. At some point, the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, smaller, slighter. Not one of the men who had taken me. The person moved closer, their face hidden by shadow until finally, the light caught the curve of a cheek, the outline of familiar eyes. "Isabella?" I breathed. She pressed a finger to her lips. "Be quiet," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice trembling. She knelt beside me, pulling a knife from her coat pocket and cutting through the ropes with quick, practiced movements. "He sent me," she said. "Luca?" She nodded once, her expression grim. "He's coming, but you have to be ready." "Ready for what?" Before she could answer, there was shouting outside, men's voices raised in alarm, the unmistakable crack of gunfire splitting the air. Isabella's eyes widened. "Now," she said, grabbing my hand. "Move." We ran, through narrow corridors, through the smell of smoke and gunpowder, through the chaos that had erupted outside. I could hear the sounds of fighting, the short, brutal rhythm of a war fought too close, too personal. And beneath it all, I heard him. Luca's voice. It wasn't shouting orders this time. It was raw, unrestrained, furious. We burst through the side door into the night, the rain returning in sheets, and there he was. Standing in the center of it all, his coat dark with blood and rain, his eyes finding mine instantly even through the chaos. Time seemed to stop then, and for one fragile, impossible second, I believed everything might be okay. That somehow he had come for me, that somehow this nightmare might end. Then I saw the man behind him, gun raised, finger tightening on the trigger. I screamed his name, but the sound was lost in the rain. The gun fired, and the world went red. The world stopped moving when the gun went off, not because time itself obeyed me, but because my body forgot how to exist inside it. There was the flash of light, the smell of rain and gunpowder mingling in the air, the echo of something sharp tearing through the night, and then the sound that has never left me. The soft, broken exhale of a man who had spent his whole life holding his breath and had finally let it go. I didn't even realize I'd fallen to my knees until the cold soaked through the thin fabric of my dress, my palms pressed against the wet concrete, my heartbeat slamming so hard against my ribs it felt like it might burst free. For a moment, I couldn't see him. There were too many people. Too much chaos. Gunfire still snapping in the distance, men shouting, rain falling in sheets so thick it blurred the edges of the world. But then I saw him stumble. He didn't fall right away. Not Luca Moretti. He was too proud, too stubborn, too unwilling to surrender even to something as final as a bullet. He turned, eyes searching the crowd, and when they found me, it was as though everything else disappeared. The men, the violence, the blood, all of it fell away, leaving only the two of us in the center of a world that had already ended. I ran. I don't remember the distance, only the sound of my feet splashing through puddles, the desperate way his name tore from my throat like a prayer I hadn't known I was capable of saying. When I reached him, his body was already giving way, the strength that had always defined him bleeding out onto the pavement, his breath shallow, his eyes impossibly calm. I fell beside him, my hands shaking as I pressed them against his wound, as if I could hold him together through sheer force of will. "Don't," I whispered, though I didn't know what I was begging for. For him not to die, for him not to leave me, for the world to make sense again. He smiled then, just faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting like it hurt him to do it. "You shouldn't have run," he said, his voice rough, broken, but still somehow steady. "You shouldn't have followed," I replied, tears mixing with the rain. He coughed, the sound raw and wet, and I pressed harder, my hands slipping in blood. "Stop talking," I said, my voice cracking. "You're going to be fine. Do you hear me? You're going to be fine." But he only looked at me, those impossible eyes still sharp even as the light began to fade from them. "You never believed my lies," he said quietly, "so don't start believing that one." I shook my head, refusing to accept it, refusing to let him turn this into another one of his damned fatal truths. "Don't do this," I whispered. "Don't you dare do this to me." He reached up then, his fingers brushing my face, leaving streaks of red on my skin that the rain tried to wash away but couldn't. His touch was weak, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that only comes when someone has nothing left to give but everything that matters. "I told you," he said, his breath uneven. "I'd burn the world before I let them take you." "And you did," I said through tears. "You did, Luca, and now there's nothing left." He smiled again, smaller this time, almost invisible, and then his hand fell, his eyes closing, his chest stilled beneath my palms. The sound that left me then didn't belong to words. It was something raw and unfiltered, something animal. A sound of loss so deep it didn't echo. It simply sank. The rain fell harder, drumming against the ground, washing his blood into the cracks of the concrete, and I sat there for what felt like forever, holding him, waiting for some impossible miracle that never came. When the shooting stopped, when the shouting turned into silence, I didn't move. I barely noticed when Isabella came, her face pale, her hands trembling as she knelt beside me. "We have to go," she said softly, but I didn't look at her. I couldn't. "He's gone," I said, and the words didn't sound real. She hesitated, then reached for me, her fingers closing gently around my wrist. "Elena, please," she whispered. "He wouldn't want you here." I laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "He didn't want me anywhere." She said nothing after that, just helped me to my feet, her touch firm, guiding, the way one might lead someone blind. I looked back once, at his body lying there in the rain, the water pooling around him, the storm covering him like a shroud. And then we left. The days that followed bled together, time losing all meaning as though the world had been reset, but forgotten to tell me. I stayed in a small safe house outside the city, a place that smelled of dust and solitude, where the windows were boarded and the silence felt heavier than the air. Isabella came and went, bringing food I couldn't eat and words I couldn't hear. It took 3 days before she told me the truth, that Luca's men had wiped out the ones who'd taken me, that his empire, the one built on fear and loyalty and blood, had begun to fracture the moment he fell. Without him, the power lines tangled, and chaos spread. "He knew it would end this way," she said quietly. "He just wanted you out before it did." The words hurt more than the silence. I spent hours replaying everything. The first time I saw him, the way his voice could command a room without raising, the way he could terrify me and make me ache for him in the same breath. I thought about the piano, the way he'd played in the dark, the way he'd said control was everything, and I wondered if he'd ever really believed that. Because in the end, he'd lost control. For me. And that was the cruelest truth of all. Sometimes I imagine that he's still alive, that somewhere, somehow, he survived, that he's out there rebuilding the kingdom he destroyed for me. I imagine his voice, calm and cold and familiar, whispering the same words he did that night in the restaurant, the ones that started all of this. "You're my wife tonight." Only this time it wouldn't be a lie. But most nights I know better. Most nights I sit by the window and listen to the rain, and I understand that some people are storms, and when you let them in, they never really leave. They live inside you, in every heartbeat, in every shadow, in every dream that refuses to fade. He wasn't my savior. He wasn't my captor. He was both and neither. He was the man who taught me that love isn't something you survive. It's something that consumes you, reshapes you, leaves you raw and remade in its image. And though the world calls him a monster, though they write his name in whispers and fear, I know the truth that none of them could ever understand, that monsters can love too, and sometimes they love harder, fiercer, more completely than anyone else. Because when he looked at me, I saw it. Not redemption, not ruin, but something that belonged to both. Something that said, "If I must die for you, I will." And he did. So now, when I walk beneath the rain, I tilt my face to the sky and let it wash over me, cold and unrelenting. And I think of him, of the man who burned the world for me, who made me his wife not in name but in truth, in blood, in sacrifice, in the silence that followed every storm. And I whisper to the night, to the memory of him that will never leave me, the words I never said while he lived. "You were my ruin, Luca Moretti, but you were also my home."